figured it out.
Alex, we got the message that it's being recorded.
Yeah, my Zoom re-updated and had logged me out of Zoom, so I had to log back in. So, a minor heart attack averted there. Susan and Bill, we had about, last time I checked, which was the start of the week, we had over 80 people registered. So from quite a few different parts of the world. And I see we've got already in the chat, there are people introducing themselves from different parts of the globe. So it's nice.
Alex, I'm not sure I can see the Q&A if people post things in there for the question section.
Okay. Should be in the chat. So maybe no one's, let me just see.
We can ask people just to put their questions in the chat rather than the Q&A.
I think that's probably best. Yeah.
Yeah, because otherwise I won't see them.
Yeah. Yeah. Good idea, Susan. Made you a co-host, Susan, so that might change things.
Hi, Tessa. Good to see you.
Hello, Bill. Hello, everybody.
Yes, sir. Just let me know when you want me to stop sharing, Susan, and I'll, yeah.
Let's give it another minute or so. There's about 19 people that are here if we're expecting a lot more. All right, I think we can probably get started. And if folks join while we're doing the introduction, that's okay. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, depending on where you sit in the world. This is the second event in the WDPI online seminar series for 2023. My name is Susan Peters. I'm a research scientist at the Harvard Center for Work, Health and Wellbeing in the US. And these seminars are organised by the ICOH Scientific Committee on Work Disability Prevention and Integration, or WDPI, as we like to call it. I just want to remind everyone who's joined to mute their microphones, and if you have any questions, to put them in the chat box rather than the Q&A, so that we can record those and address them at the end. Today's presentation is being recorded, and a copy of the seminar will be made available online via the Scientific Committee website, which is available at www.wdpi.net. Today, we would like to welcome Dr. Bill Shaw to our seminar series. Bill is recently retired from the University of Connecticut in the USA, where he served as Chief of the Division of Occupational and Environmental Medicine. Dr. Shaw has more than 25 years of research experience in the field of occupational health and safety. His primary research has focused on workplace pain, disability, and return to work, especially with respect to psychosocial and organisational factors affecting outcomes for workers with injuries or chronic health conditions. His research has contributed to current knowledge of effective employer policies, supervisor training, job modification, disability management, psychosocial screening tools, and return to work coordination. Quite a gamut of things over his 25 years of research in the field. He has published more than 150 journal articles and book chapters, and he has been a collaborator internationally on research projects in Australia, Canada, Sweden, and the Netherlands. So thank you, Bill. I'll hand it over to you.
Okay, let me share my screen. Let's see. All right, and how is that? Okay. All right, I'll go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone, and thank you, Dr. Peters, for that nice introduction. And also thank you to the ICOH Scientific Committee on WDPI for allowing me this chance to speak. So my title is a little bit rhetorical, probably, and I won't be able to answer this question in any fine-grained way for you today. But what I'd like to talk about is the sometimes complex interface between workers and their employers during times of return to work planning, during job modification arrangements, during accommodation requests, and especially focusing on how the ways that employers provide informal organizational support during these critical times for workers. So and then kind of talking about how we can try to characterize this in our research and how it can be used in best practice evidence summaries as well. So thank you for joining today, and I hope this has some relevance for you in your research or practice. So before I get into talking about informal accommodation, I just want to recognize that there are many formal ways that employers help workers, and these are ways that are very much mandated of employers in many of our countries, use laws and regulations that govern occupational health and safety. So most workers expect that there would be some form of wage replacement, either sick leave or indemnity payments for lost work time. Access to quality medical care, whether that's provided through an employer or through a social insurance system. Job preservation, so people expect that their job will still be waiting for them if they're out of work for a time. And reasonable accommodation. I'll talk a little bit more about accommodation, but most of that accommodation from a regulatory standpoint occurs when a worker makes a specific request for accommodation under a law that allows that. But the question I want to talk about today is, in addition to these kinds of mandated things that employers provide, what is the role of more informal forms of organizational support that are meaningful to workers, and how can we sort of understand that a little bit better? So when I first got interested in this, excuse me, still just getting over something. So I think when I first got interested in this topic was when we were conducting some focus groups with workers who were in the process of returning to work. And what we were trying to understand was a little bit more information about the job modification process. How does this actually play out in real life between workers and their employers? And we had always started out with this question of, what did your employer change to allow you to return to work or stay at work? And we're really underwhelmed by how little workers had to say in response to this question. There was the occasional mention of transitional duty or maybe changing in work hours, but for the most part, people had very little to say. And we kind of tried to pump them for a little more information, and it wasn't working very well. And then at one point they told us, you're really asking this question in the wrong way. What you should be asking is, what did your employer allow you to change so that you could return to work? And once we turned the question around that way, they had just loads and loads of information to share about their job modification process. And it sort of made us aware in our research group of just how much more in control workers are of the job modification process than we had previously thought, and how important it was for them to be a part of that process. So that was really kind of eye-opening for us. And they also described, once we turned this question around, all sorts of ways in which employers help them that were not the usual kinds of things that we were thinking about in terms of accommodation or job modification. So they said my employer was very helpful, and this is a long list, but I'm actually going to read through it because I think this is kind of captures the essence of what I'm trying to say. That they said my employer was very helpful. They allowed me to do my work differently. They connected me with coworkers to help me. They understood that sometimes I would have good days or bad days. They let me take charge of the problem myself. They showed some concern for my health and well-being. They reminded me of my existing job flexibility that I had without having to ask permission. They cut me some slack when it came to things like deadlines and pace of work. They helped me manage things as best I could. They appreciated that pain sometimes made things hard for me. And so this really shows just how many ways that, and these were expressed in really imperative ways. So workers said that these were extremely important to them at the time of trying to return to work, but these are not things we would normally think of as something that would be sort of counted in an HR department as a job modification. So I'm interested in how we can get a better handle on this. Hang on, I gotta move things around on my screen a little bit. Okay. We also have other types of research we've done around return to work and job modification that are also a signal that maybe these organizational issues are extremely important. So one of them is when we were developing the return to work self-efficacy scale a few years back, we coded information that people provided. So these were focus groups where people were asked, what are the most challenging things that you face around return to work, and what are the things that you need to feel confident about before you return to work. And they had statements about resuming physical tasks and being able to meet expectations of workload. And those are the kinds of things that sort of align pretty well with job modifications as we normally think of them. But what was interesting was that actually most of their comments were about how I'm going to be able to obtain assistance and deal with some of the social issues in the workplace when I return to work, and how I'm actually going to be able to cope with pain or being less than 100% while I'm on the job. And so these are another indication from our research that these organizational issues are extremely important for workers, and they sort of fall outside of the usual types of job modifications and accommodations that we have actually keep track of. So my question for us is, are there elements of informal organizational support that are really critical to workers at a time when they have had an injury or an illness? And are these things kind of falling outside of our usual bean counting of job modification processes? And how can these be incorporated into our research in work disability prevention and also into employer best practices? We do have some information from systematic reviews. I think this wasn't always the case. It's kind of a growing body of literature to suggest that various forms of organizational support do matter in terms of return to work outcomes. So the first systematic review here was done by Sandra Brower and colleagues, and looked at early labor market exit of workers with poor health, and found that supervisor support and workplace accommodations were important. There was another review by Paul Campbell and colleagues in the UK, found that a weak effect, but nevertheless an effect of employment support, things like co-worker support and general worker support were indicative of, were related to recovery and return to work outcomes. So we do have some evidence, but I think what's a little frustrating for me from these systematic reviews is that usually the measures of organizational support and supervisor support are quite general, the kinds of things we would normally see in organizational psychology research, and don't really capture some of that. I think what are the important points of how organizations support workers. So one of the efforts by our research group to try to address this was to develop a construct that we thought captured at least some of these aspects of informal job support, and we called this health-related job leeway. So this was trying to capture the what workers were telling us about employers sort of cutting them some slack during a time of having a bad day or having intermittent symptoms. So we define this officially as the margins of freedom, variation, and tolerance available to workers to self-regulate work activities while managing day-to-day symptom fluctuations. And what led us to this construct was working with workers who have intermittent and episodic types of disability problems. But we did recognize that this would depend on the nature of the job. So the type of job you have, if you're a school bus driver, it might be really difficult to have leeway. In other types of jobs, it might be easier. Also, employers may have kind of organizational norms and policies that would affect the ability to provide leeway. And thirdly, that some jobs are just require a high degree of standardization for safety or quality that would sort of inhibit the ability of employers to provide a lot of leeway. But nevertheless, we thought it was something that would help to define some of these things that workers were telling us. So we actually developed a thing called the Job Leeway Scale, and this has just been recently published in the Journal of Occupational Rehabilitation. So that's one of the reasons that I thought this was a timely subject for today. So the kinds of questions in the Job Leeway Scale, they all have the same anchor. They all start with when I'm not feeling well, and then a list of 18 questions. And you see some of the examples here. I can rotate between job tasks. Uncomfortable or stressful aspects of my job can be avoided in a bad day. People can shift responsibilities to help me. I can take more micro breaks, etc. And people answer just to what extent they have that flexibility on an agreement scale from 0 to 6. So we tried it out in terms of psychometric evaluation with 119 workers that we were working with who had chronic illness, and we're concerned that their illness might inhibit their ability to stay on the job for a long time. They were from 5 different employer settings. 3 of those were healthcare, but I think we had a pretty good representation of people from really different types of jobs within healthcare. There was a good distribution of scores, so it did look like people had really different levels of leeway in their jobs, and there was no like ceiling or floor effect, so it was a good distribution on items. The reliability looked good in terms of internal consistency, so a high alpha level of 0.94. And we did some exploratory factor analyses and showed that this showed initially that there were 3 different types of leeway. One has to do with organizational leeway, is what we called it. It was 9 items, and as an example, working from home. So these were ways that the organization could sort of change the way you're doing your work to make it easier. Task leeway had specifically to do with the nature of the job you're performing and the ability of that job to be able to be varied in response to an illness or injury flare-up. And then staffing leeway. So this had to do with how flexible it was for people to kind of shift responsibilities and move around and cover for you on a bad day. And we found that in this initial evaluation, there were moderate correlations with things like fatigue, self-efficacy, engagement, and productivity. So it did seem to be related to important outcomes in the occupational health and safety realm, but not completely redundant with things that have already been studied before. So anyone can use the Job Leeway Scale if it has any relevance for your research, but recognizing that there are also some other scales that are a little bit related to this topic. There's a supervisor support for return to work scale that was developed a few years back. There's an organizational policies and practices scale that does include sort of proactive support of employers to address return to work issues. There's a support for workers with disabilities scale, which also touches on some of these issues as well. So we have a number of scales, but I think actually there's a lot more work that could be done in this space. What does this really tell us in terms of theoretical perspectives that we've had for a long time around return to work strategies? I think that probably what I would suggest is that we maybe should move from less of a job match way of thinking about return to work and more of a self-management strategy. So the changes that workers or that employers provide, or the things that are negotiated between workers and employers, maybe are not just about trying to remove hazardous job responsibilities during a time of an injury, but actually just trying to give that worker the ability to self-manage the condition on their own. So I think that for me, that's the difference in theoretical perspective. So this self-management model was one that was developed from intervention mapping by Sarah Detali and colleagues. And I think that we're kind of moving, that was for chronic illness, but I think we're actually kind of, we might want to move more in that direction for work injuries and other more acute types of problems as well. So next I'm going to shift to intervention. So how can we actually capture these informal types of organizational support for workers in the context of practices? And I'm going to give an example of one that's focused mostly on employees, one that's focused mostly on employer, and then one that's kind of involves an interaction of employee and employer. So the first one is a study from my own research group. This was called the Manage at Work study. It was focused on workers with chronic health conditions. And the goal was to really help workers, give them some creative ways that they could use existing leeway and support they had within their organization to be able to perform better on the job and to feel a little bit better about their future on the job. So it was a 10-week on-site program. It was employer sponsored and hosted in some ways. So it was 10 hours in total, and it was facilitated by an employee assistance program counselor. It was involved both didactic and group discussion, but it was based largely on chronic illness self-management models, if you're familiar with that, but a little bit less about diet and exercise and things like that, and more focused on actual practices that workers could implement themselves in their workplace. So issues of pacing, communication, whether I choose to disclose something or not to my employer or to my coworkers, how I take care of myself when I'm at work, things around ergonomics and work style. How am I going to cope with a bad day? How am I going to get help from people without driving them crazy? How can I do some organizational problem solving of my own when I encounter problems? So we actually tested this program out, and we focused on our primary outcomes of work engagement, work limitations, and turnover intent. But we actually included a lot of other measures when we conducted the study. We worked with 5 employers, 119 workers volunteered, and we had 6-month follow-up. We weren't able to do longer term follow-up for just some funding reasons, but we looked at the outcomes at 6 months. And what we found were that there was improved work engagement and retention, also improved job satisfaction, but no improvement in the perceptions of workers to be completing more work, so workplace function. So I think what this tells us is that it helped people feel a little bit more confident in their work, but didn't really make them more functional at work. So we probably have more work to do to be able to do both. I think the lesson learned from this study was that if you just focus solely on workers, you're kind of missing an opportunity to engage supervisors and employers more directly in the kinds of problems that the workers are facing. So I think it's always just working with workers has some limits to it. The next study I'm going to describe is focusing more on employers. And this is called the Miles Intervention. It was recently published. It's the dissertation work of Michiel Grijdenis in the Netherlands, and Miles stands for the missing link, optimizing return to work of employees diagnosed with cancer by supporting employers. And it was focused on recently diagnosed in the past 2 years sick listed cancer survivors. And the goal was to improve employer support and return to work process. So really trying to use this idea of just how do we get employers to be more responsive to workers and be able to kind of tailor their level of support to workers on an individual basis. And it was a very brave effort. It was really an intervention solely intended for the employer. It was a just-in-time web-based employer intervention program. So this is a brave effort to try to actually have workers recruit their employers to participate in a program on their behalf. So the content of this just-in-time web-based employer intervention was information, videos, checklists, trying to give information and guidance to employers, showing them how to tailor their approach to individual worker needs, trying to make them sensitive to issues of disclosure, and providing more effective support, especially based on different phases of cancer recovery. And they used an intervention mapping approach to come up with all the materials for that. But working with employers is very difficult. And what they found was that patients were extremely reluctant to participate. So the recruitment was very low. They had many hundreds of people initially contacted, but only 4% of those actually chose to participate. And a few of those who did choose to participate actually were reluctant to inform their employer afterwards. So there's really, even with something like cancer that you think would be a very bona fide reason to be talking to your employer about job modification, there was a lot of reluctance from workers. But employers, the employers who were engaged in the study actually did access the materials, 82% did. So there was a pretty good uptake on the employer side. But unfortunately, with this small sample size that they had, they found no group differences in return to work rates. So I think it was a brave effort to try to actually work directly with employers, but was met with a lot of challenges in terms of actually having workers feel comfortable with that. So the lesson learned is really that, patients are a little bit uncertain about having someone contact their employers and on their behalf to help them out with things like return to work. So the final example I want to give of a kind of an intervention effort that involves both employee and employer is represented by this study, the Job Demands and Accommodation Planning Tool, which is called JDAPT. And this is an effort that is being conducted in Canada, led by Monique Gignac at the Institute for Work and Health in Toronto. And I wanted to give you, and I want to thank her for sharing a few slides with me that will help me to describe this effort to you. But I think it's really captures many of these informal accommodation strategies that I'm talking about. And the subtitle of the JDAPT is an interactive tool to identify work-related support strategies for workers with chronic conditions and disabilities. So this group struck out looking at workers with episodic and intermittent forms of disability as a problem space that they wanted to address. This work is funded by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada primarily, but has other forms of support. And what's really amazing about this effort is just how much trouble has been taken to both attract a large group of collaborating researchers, but also a large consortium of agencies, patient associations, employers, and other government agencies to really try to do this right. So it's a pretty large scale effort. And what they started to do with this measure, or what they had as an ambition was, or the problems that they were looking at were, how do we get workers support while respecting their privacy and their desire not to share physical or mental health condition diagnoses? The rules in Canada, the laws are pretty strict in terms of protecting employee privacy. And how do we help workplaces implement a transparent, consistent, and comprehensive approach to assessing individualized worker job needs? And where can workers and workplaces get support and accommodation issues? So there's kind of a lack of information and process to do this better. So they have begun development of this thing called the Job Demands and Accommodation Planning Tool. It's an online tool that focuses on work demands that may be difficult at times or regularly for workers. It doesn't really specifically limited to any particular disability diagnosis, so it was developed in a really broad sense. It guides users through a series of simple questions about their job task and working conditions and their health, and provides a personalized list of support ideas relevant to an individual's job demands that are currently challenging. So there's both a worker and an employer component to this. And it is also the goal of this to develop a list of options and suggestions for workers and for their employers as a result of the questions that are answered. So just to give you a better flavor of this, so they did quite a bit of formative work to decide, how to develop these materials, and they identified 24 types of job demands and working conditions. They're organized within 4 domains. Those are physical demands, cognitive or thinking demands, working with others, so the social aspects of the workplace, and working conditions, so more environmental kinds of things. And there's a worker version that is nearing completion, and there's an organizational version that is still under development. And so for each work demand that users are replying to, they also give information about the relative importance of that task to their job, how difficult it is due to their health, and is this something that changes in ability over time? So is it a problem every day, or is it a problem just once in a while? And this generates a personalized report and gives them a recommendation strategies. And this is where I think this is relevant to my topic, which is that the list of strategies and accommodations are a lot of things that people can do themselves, not necessarily things that they need to request from their employer. So if you had, for example, expressed that you had problems concentrating for long periods of time, this software would give you things you might try on your own, adjustments you could try at work that you may or may not need to request permission for, and then things that would be more of a formal accommodation nature. So I think this JDAP is really very inventive by giving people information that can be done on their own or with the help of their employer. So there are English and French versions of the JDAP, and you can actually go to the website if you click on this link or write it down. Anyone can use it. It's free to use, and the data are not saved in any way. So if you're to address the privacy issue with this measure, they chose to make that information sort of erased as soon as you get the feedback report. The JDAP that's intended for employers is still under development, but it should be uploadable soon. So with that, I wanted to conclude just with some brief discussion items. So in addition to explicit job accommodations that we all kind of know from our return to work knowledge, is that workers actually may rely on leeway and other very informal forms of organizational and workplace support in order to return to work or stay at work. Using this available leeway and other informal supports may be really helpful to help workers self-manage problems. And maybe that's something that we need to introduce more prominently in our research and in our best practices. I think that research methods should be sort of expanded to try to capture some of this important information outside of things that are documentable job modifications. We should incorporate elements of informal support, not just into research, but into looking to the future for tools and resources that would be available to workers and employers similar to the JDAP measure. So that's it for my presentation. I encourage you to ask questions in the chat, and we can have some further discussion. I know that laws and regulations concerning employer support and organizational support are very different in different countries and different systems. So I'm sure that we all have very different experiences with this issue. Thank you.
Thanks, Bill. So if anyone has a question, just raise your hand and we can open the floor to any questions that you might have. Hans is giving you a round of applause. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, so I have a question, Bill. So it kind of, when we're sort of thinking about the types of supervisors and employers that are providing support to their workers that may have chronic health problems, kind of struck me that the types of employers and supervisors that are doing that probably already have, good psychological safety, good health culture within their workplace, and are more kind of likely to access those types of resources or look for them. So is there any research out there that started to think about how we can, formalize, I guess, these more informal kind of mechanisms so that supervisors that probably need help with this sort of stuff or often don't see it as part of their job because they're busy, they're working, they're dealing with putting out fires in their own kind of, workplace, so to speak. How can we kind of start to support, sort of make these kind of informal mechanisms more formal?
Yeah, great question. And it's a hard one to answer. I think we certainly do have scales that look very globally at safety culture measures. We have things that tell us a little bit about just organizational support as an overall construct within, and we do see variation from employer to employer. So from one employer to the next, there certainly are differences in the way that people approach their safety and wellness kinds of issues. But I think what I've been thinking about is how you drill down a little bit further into things that are more relevant specifically for disability management and return to work struggle. I know there's an effort recently to develop a scale of return to work culture. But the thing that makes this very complicated is that, and I think we heard this from a lot of workers, is that even within the same workplace, so there might be some top-down cultural issues within a workplace that sort of specify some of these types of supports, but really at the individual working group and the individual supervisor level, the response can be very, very different. So it's probably not something that can be totally a top-down effort on the part of employers to make this happen. I think somehow you have to drill down to individual supervisor and working group level to provide tools and resources that are kind of just in time. Because I think, you don't face a worker with a disability problem every day, and you need to be able to go somewhere when it happens, so you know what to say and how to be careful about confidentiality and how to be supportive as possible, but not feel like you're getting yourself in trouble in some way. So I think supervisors are really important in this, and it seems to be like where the rubber meets the road is that relationship between a worker and their supervisor that we need to focus on. So it's probably training that's really important to convey this. So it's not necessarily at the very top of a company. I think it's something that needs to happen at a more granular level and the department level, but difficult to measure and difficult to specify for people who want to do a better job.
Thanks, Bill. So we've got a question from Jay Green. Sorry, I don't know what your first name is, but if you'd like to unmute.
It's Janice.
Hi, Janice.
Right. Hi. Suzanne, you have worded it so nicely what I wanted to ask. And Bill has answered in part. I have a family member who has been at home since February with a cancer. And she's getting better. And she's expected to return to work before the end of the year. But when I listen to what you say, I know her job has been preserved. There is access to quality medical care. But I'm not quite sure about the reasonable accommodation that will be made when she returns to work. And you just said now about it comes down to the supervisor and the worker. So I'm here, I'm in your presentation because I want to guide her as to how to approach this with her immediate supervisor so that there can be some leeway, with her task and probably with the staffing. But then you say that there is nothing. I was really looking for something I can pull and say, hey, this is what is being used in Australia or somewhere, and so she could share it with her supervisor.
Yes, thank you for that. I think one thing that is important to remember is that we've done work with supervisors on some of these topics, and what we almost always see is that the training that supervisors have received has sort of paralyzed them in many ways. So they're afraid that there's so many laws around privacy of workers, and it's a very medical issue that they don't understand, and so they have an awful lot of hesitation to wade into these waters on their own. So they'll sort of hold back because they're afraid they're going to say the wrong thing, that it's none of their business. And so I think I would encourage, in a case like this, the worker or your family member to really be a little assertive about this problem. I think that when things work out well, it's often because the worker themselves has taken ownership of this and has really tried to reach out to their supervisor in advance of coming back to work and have some discussions with them. That isn't always well received, but I think usually is. So I think supervisors are a little bit relieved that the workers come to them and shared information about their situation without them having to ask, which I think this is for a lot of supervisors feels like dangerous waters in terms of what can I actually ask people about their health? How can I be helpful? I'm not sure. So supervisors have a lot of hesitation. So I think when workers kind of make a phone call to their supervisor when they're out of work or they email them and just say, just checking in, how are things going? Is there anything we could talk about in terms of my future return that might be useful? And of course, employers have really different rules and restrictions about this, but I think my general recommendation would be that workers shouldn't hesitate at all to make demands and engage at different levels within the organization to get the help they need.
Thank you so much for this, Bill. I just pick up the words that I'm going to use to her: assertive, check in, and have the discussion in advance.
And
right.
I think, one thing we've heard from a lot from workers with chronic illness conditions is it is important to know your organization well. I mean, workplace cultures just, vary widely in terms of the kind of work you're doing, the kind of culture that you're part of. And so it is important to know, kind of test the waters slowly or something like that to make sure that maybe talk to other workers, try to find somebody else who's been in a similar predicament and see how things went for them. So trying to understand, what I want to be careful as a worker, as well as I want to assert my needs too.
Right. Thank you so much for this guidance.
Karen?
Hi, thank you very much. Bill, thank you very much for a very good presentation. I do apologize if you answered my question in the presentation, but I'm going to pose it anyway. First of all, I also want to say I had actually written a note about good organizational culture, and I'm so glad that you've just mentioned that, because I see a lot of this depending on the kind of culture that is created and the safeness that people feel within an organization, which maybe leads to what my question is. There's a large sector of our working population that does not have flexibility within their working environment. And I specifically think here of healthcare workers. They often are already working with skeleton staffs, and to start accommodating individual requests, etc., can be even more challenging. Have you got any recommendations or any comments about how we could assist those people who are working in those less flexible working environments?
Yes, we had some healthcare workers in our self-management program. So we were definitely up against this kind of issue of really long working hours and having to be, your day, you walk in the door in the hospital and have, what every day is going to involve. So you can't really plan ahead for a lot. We did find still some wiggle room for them to try to take better hold of things, and not at an organizational level. So they didn't tend to be blanket changes within the organization to make things better, but on an individual level, if you kind of keep asking, how do I work, and the ability to take breaks was a big issue for nurses, for example. Having a place that you can go and just kind of recover was really important. And making sure that you get this level of support from your coworkers and from others around you that you need. And one issue that we heard a lot about was that people struggled with disclosure quite a bit, and they didn't want to be a pest. They, especially in a healthcare setting, they didn't want to put their burden of health problems on everybody else. And when they did that, if they did that excessively, that could really be a problem for you, because now people just avoid you and don't want to talk to you. But in other cases, if you just made little requests, like, could you help me just lift that over there? and then be done with it. You don't have to give people your whole medical history. You just say, I need help with that. Can you help me do that? So talking about how to communicate specific needs in a way that doesn't drive people crazy was really important. So I think in the healthcare setting, it was very social. It was about how you work with the people around you and how you get a little bit more control of of how you do things day in, day out. So I think it had a lot, they talked a lot about the people around them and how they should share a disability problem and what's kind of the right way to do that, that's going to be most effective. So that's probably not, I think for the nurses, for healthcare workers, it wasn't about like physical changes in their work. It was more of a mental process of kind of coping and dealing with the people around you and allowing yourself some self-care. So whether it was wearing more comfortable shoes or doing things on a bad day that made you feel a little bit better, those were important for them as coping mechanisms.
Thank you.
Hands?
Hello. Thank you very much, Bill, for this really interesting topic and presentation. It was one of the moments where you as a scientist regret that you didn't know things before, because we're conducting a large, and yes, I'm Hans-Martin Haslund, and I'm professor for occupational health science at the University of Wuppertal in Germany. And we are conducting a really large-scale study, a representative study of older workers in Germany with many thousand participants. And we are actually assessing, as you say, accommodations or measures to promote health and workability of the workers. And sometimes I ask myself, why are we doing that? I think the one finding is that if people get these measures, if people with poor health get these measures, that they rate these measures as being helpful in 90% of all cases, which is really very much. But the problem is that only, all in all, it is 1 out of 6 people who do have poor health who actually in the end can receive these measures. And so I think one of the major problems is not how to get the scientific publication published, but how to reach the enterprises with this, because obviously there seems to be very much potential. So do you have how do you approach or how did you approach enterprises with the topic you're dealing with?
Well, I don't know if this is true in Germany, but in the US, some employers, larger employers who have like federal contracts and things are being asked more and more to report on the processes that they have internally or the organizational structures to provide accommodation to workers with disabilities. So, one of the things they've realized is that they don't have good bookkeeping of these things internally, and that probably, I think there's another case to be made that it's probably just the tip of the iceberg. So when you count accommodation requests and that were honored, those are probably just a very small smattering of all the things that an employer does to help support workers who are older or who have chronic health conditions. And so in some ways, I think the pitch for employers is that you're probably doing your supervisors and your management structure is probably doing a whole lot more to help workers, whether it's counseling workers, whether it's making sort of slight adjustments. If employers do this all the time, they don't really call it accommodation, but if you have 5 workers and one's 90 years old and one's 30 years old, you probably give them different tasks to do. So we probably make adjustments for people's health in all sorts of ways that employers don't get credit for. So I think that's been one talking point I know that has been important for employers. Like, oh yeah, we're actually, our supervisors, they hear about health problems all the time, but only a very few of them actually rise to this issue of an employer making a specific accommodation request that gets well documented within the organization. So, I share your the challenge of trying to capture these things, because it's not, what is it called, that employers understand. And I think that's still a challenge that we have.
Mm. Susan, may I shortly reply and report on the German situation for 1 minute?
Sure, go for it.
Yeah, so because you asked, since 20 years, we have a law which says that if someone has been sick listed for more than 30 days in the past 12 months, that the employer has the obligation to contact this person and to provide reintegration management. And so I'm actually currently summarizing the data on that, and we're going to publish that. And those people, they're really sick at the first place. And there were these 16% of the people, of all eligible people, only in the end of this process get measures. Yeah, less than half are being contacted anyways, although it should be that way. Yes. So even though we have a law requiring this type of engagement, and even though this engagement seems to be extremely helpful, it is very rarely performed. Yeah, so it's which of course is a challenging topic for us too. Right now we are going to prepare a brochure on this topic, and we hope to spread it via the internet and other opportunities. Okay, thank you.
Thank you for that example. And I think how you actually mandate this sort of communication and informal support within the employment setting is a challenge. But I think what you described, and there are some other programs like this. I know in some laws like this in Sweden, for example, where there's an mandated meeting of some sort. And I think getting people in the room together to communicate about the problem is probably a really important step, and probably the only kind of way that we can get this to happen from a regulatory standpoint. So I think that's actually a really it sounds like it's not always working, but it's giving workers one opportunity to kind of get people's attention and say, hey, I have a problem, and it's beginning to cause more sick leave and issues for me, and it's time that we sit down and talk about it. So that's actually a really good example of kind of a regulatory effort to try to make communication happen without really specifying any particular type of accommodation.
Yeah, exactly.
Thank you.
Alex?
Thank you, Susan, and thanks, Bill, for a wonderful presentation. We also have laws here in Australia. Sorry, Alex Colley from Monash University in Melbourne in Australia. We also have laws here in Australia that sort of require employers to have some forms of accommodation for injured or ill workers. And that kind of relates to my question. Is we hear anecdotally and in some of the research evidence that we're producing that relationship, particularly between supervisors and workers that you talked about, Bill, is particularly challenging in the case of people with mental health conditions in the workplace. And I just wondered if you could comment on the research that you presented and the sort of extent to which it considers mental health conditions, and if you think they produce, because of the nature of those, the disabilities that the worker might be experiencing in those cases, if they produce a sort of qualitatively different relationship or different situation between a worker and an employer.
Yeah, thank you for that question. And I did most of my research on this topic early on in the US, and so it was sort of had sort of a branding of the US model, which is that work injuries typically don't include mental health issues. And so I started out really thinking of more physical types of injuries. I think the JDAP, there was a huge effort during development and the formative stages of this to really capture all these things, and not just depression, but really thinking about other kinds of attention deficits and other kinds of problems that people would have that are more of a mental health variety, and not labeling them. So there's no like, here's physical, here's mental, but really talking about, is it hard for you to attend to your job? And using language that's a little more accepting for employers. So still allowing work, and in Canada, the laws are very strict around privacy. So as I understand it, workers don't even have to give a diagnosis. They just say, I'm having a problem with this type of activity. How can you help me? In the US, it's a much more biomedical model. So there's a lot hinges on having a bona fide medical certification of this disabling problem that before you can actually qualify for an accommodation under the Americans with Disabilities Act. So it's a much more medically oriented and more physically oriented kind of problem. But I think the JDAP has been pretty good at trying to capture the mental health problems as well. And of course, workers have, they have combinations of problems. So it's not really a, dichotomy in the way that we sometimes think. But I just didn't answer your question, but I think moving forward, there are much larger issues with disclosure for workers. It's much more difficult to quantify work limitations for mental health problems. So these really, and mental health problems are very, very prevalent in working years. So all of these things would tell us that this is an area that we should really put a lot of effort into in trying to understand informal accommodations. And probably, I would say that for mental health problems where workers are reluctant to report, probably a lot of things do happen informally because maybe a supervisor gets a sense that, okay, this person's like not happy today, and so I'm not going to give them a new job to do. Like there's probably on a day-to-day basis a lot of negotiation that goes on around mental health.
Thank you, Bill.
Bill, we have one question in the chat. I'll read it out. What is your recommendation to handle the return to work process in micro or very small companies in non-regulated environments?
Oh, great question. And I had never really talked about how different employers can be. I think, we had in our various focus groups and things that we've conducted with workers over the years, we've been really interested to see that, well, first of all, if you're self-employed, then you have a whole lot of leeway and flexibility in how you do your work. But if you work in a small employment setting, what's interesting is that social factors become much, much more important. So if I work in like a small auto repair shop or something like that, where there are only 7 or 8 people or whatever the number is that falls below the regulatory requirements, those people probably know each other pretty well. They probably know their health pretty well. They could probably sometimes list off, what diagnosis each person in my group has because they know each other so well. And so a lot of the natural forms of accommodation and job modification occur almost organically in that kind of an environment. So what we heard from workers is that they knew each other so well in those smaller employment settings that they actually they did the right thing just sort of organically. So there wasn't a need to like put in a lot of procedures in place because people just sort of helped each other out naturally to an extent to some point. And then, but in larger companies, a lot of that sort of washes out, and so you have to kind of institute the procedure that you want people to do. But in a very small work setting, what we heard people say was that, well, we know each other so well that we do this every day. So if somebody's hungover because they went to a bachelor party last night, we don't give them the safety sensitive work the next morning. They're doing these kinds of strange modifications on a day-to-day basis just to satisfy the health problems that people have day in, day out.
Thanks, Bill. I don't see any more questions, Alex, and we've only got a few more minutes to go. Do you want to share your last slide and just with the announcements?
Sure, thanks, Susan. I'll just load a slide. Thank you, everyone, for listening. My name's Alex Colley. I'm the president of the Scientific Committee for Work Disability Prevention and Integration at the moment. And I just wanted to let you know about some of the activities of the committee that are coming up and some ways you can keep in touch with our activities. We have a website, which is here on the screen, wdpi.net, and there's a newsletter that you can sign up for via that website. And we tend to promote these sorts of activities through that newsletter occasionally. We have 2 seminars coming up in September from Dr. Margot Jewson from Tilburg University in the Netherlands, and in November from Professor Peter Smith from the Institute for Work and Health in Canada. We're also encouraging people to submit ideas for future seminars. So if you would like to speak yourself, or if you would like to suggest a colleague or someone you'd like to hear from, please get in touch. The person who organises these is Dr. Daniel Griffiths from here at Monash University. His email is on the screen. And finally, I just wanted to remind you that the ICOH conference next year is in Morocco in April and early May. And we're just a few days out from the submission deadline for free paper abstracts. So if you have been thinking about going to Morocco or thinking about attending the ICOH conference, the next couple of days is a good time to get your abstract submissions in. And I have just listed the website for the conference there, and you can follow the links to the abstract submission. Thanks, Susan. That's it from me. Thank you all for coming along.
Thanks, Bill. It was a great presentation, and hopefully we'll see you all again in September.
Take care, everyone.
Thanks. Goodbye.
Susan and Alex, is there anything more that you wanted to talk about before I hang up?
Thanks, Bill. It was great. I'll just stay on for a little while until people have logged off, and then I can save the recording. It was really interesting. You got some great questions too.
Yeah, I'm glad. It went a little faster than I had planned, but but they were great questions, so it helped add a lot.
People were engaged. It's fantastic. And well chaired, Susan.
No problem, anytime. I'll see you in November at the conference, hopefully.
Oh, in Sydney. Yeah, of course. Yeah. There's so many conferences on at the end of this year. I keep forgetting which one.
I know. I understand the feeling.
Are either of you going to the India Primus?
No, I couldn't fit it in with all the other conferences that I'm attending. I could have done it virtually, but I'm not as engaged in a virtual conference. So I've been trying to, pick and choose which ones I go to, and giving preference for the ones that are in person.
Yeah. I am supposed to be going there, Bill, but in person. But a few family commitments here might get in the way, I think.
It's a big trip too. It's closer for you than for some, but
yeah, it's actually not too far.
Big project.
Here. It's one flight from here, actually, from Australia. So
really
unusual. Yeah.
Well, I'm going to jump off because I've got a 9 o'clock meeting that I'm also chairing. So I'll see you.
Thank you so much, Susan.
Thanks, Susan.
Bye.
All right.
All right. Great.
Bye, Alex.
Again, Bill. See you later.
You too. Thanks.